It was a scorching summer noon. While the adults were taking their afternoon nap, I quietly slipped out the door. Behind the village lay a vast field connected to a river, with a long embankment that seemed to stretch endlessly. I had never walked the entire length of that embankment and had no idea where it led. That day, the embankment shimmered strangely under the sun, and I suddenly decided that I had to find out what lay at its end. Climbing up the embankment with some effort, I walked for what felt like an eternity. The scenery around me remained unchanged, the river still rippled gently, and the crops in the fields looked identical. After walking for a long time, I was both hungry and thirsty. The sun was sinking quickly, and the glaring sunlight had already disappeared. Suddenly, an old woman in tattered clothes appeared ahead, hobbling towards me with a cane.
Where?
She was muttering something, her eyes vacant and her expression strange. As I approached, she waved her cane excitedly. Terrified, I darted around her and decided that if I didn't see the end of the road by the faint yellow light ahead, I would turn back immediately. The croaking of frogs grew louder in the nearby grass, and the overwhelming sense of loss at dusk made me increasingly anxious. Holding back my tears, I moved closer to the warm light source. Then, the noisy croaking abruptly ceased for a few seconds, and the air seemed to freeze. The usual rustling sounds of a summer evening felt as though they were separated from me by an invisible vacuum wall. Trembling, I stopped to observe my surroundings. The riverside was unusually quiet, and the once vibrant vegetation on both banks seemed to have lost its color, appearing lifeless and gray. The light was unnaturally dim for the time of day, and I held my breath, not daring to disturb the powerful, indescribable presence.
Hey!
A sudden slap on my shoulder jolted me back to reality. Instead of the expected terror, the croaking of frogs and the burst of colors flooded my senses, as if a lost soul had been gently guided back into its body.
Why are you playing on the embankment so late?
The girl was half a head shorter than me. Standing close, she tilted her head slightly to look at me playfully.
I wanted to walk the entire embankment to see what's at the end, but I've been walking for so long and still haven't seen it. I don't recognize this part of the road anymore. I'm really curious, but it looks like I won't make it today. I need to head back home before it gets dark.
For some reason, her question made me feel inexplicably at ease. Grasping the chance to talk to someone, I poured out my fears in a torrent of words.
Have you been walking alone all afternoon?
Why are you playing on the embankment so late?
I wanted to walk the entire embankment to see what's at the end. But I've been walking for so long and still haven't seen it. I don't recognize this part of the road anymore. I'm really curious. But it looks like I won't make it today. I need to head back home before it gets dark.
For some reason, her question made me feel inexplicably at ease. Grasping the chance to talk to someone, I poured out my fears in a torrent of words.
Have you been walking alone all afternoon?
The next day, I came down with a fever. Children are usually resilient to high temperatures, but that day, I was in a daze and couldn't speak. Helen laid out a cool mat in the main room and placed a bamboo pillow on it. I lay there, half awake and half asleep. The breeze blew through the hall all day. In that small village with extremely poor medical resources, Robert and Helen never took me to the hospital. During this time, Lily from the neighboring village came to play with me.
Why is she lying there sleeping? She has a high fever and needs to be cooled down by the wind.
Lily stayed quietly by my side that day, busy and adorably so. Perhaps my fever was too high. I slept and woke in the hall, not knowing how high my temperature had risen, but I felt a strange calmness inside. After an unknown amount of time, the breeze carried the faint scent of burning wood, and I had a surreal dream. I was lost in a forest, wandering around a dark two-story house. Just as my legs felt like they were filled with lead and I couldn't move, a semi-transparent little sprite, looking like a 3-year-old child, took my hand. It led me through twists and turns until we found a tabby kitten. The kitten was tiny, seemingly just born, and it rubbed against my leg, meowing softly.
Hello there, little one.
I crouched down to pick up the kitten, but it suddenly arched its back, fur bristling, and jumped away defensively.
What's wrong?
I felt a cool sensation on my neck. Turning around, I saw a red and white snake hovering 3 inches above the ground, its large, round eyes staring at me. Goosebumps erupted on my arms and legs, and I stood frozen in place. The kitten growled and backed away. I thought it was going to retreat and run away. Suddenly, the sprite ran from behind me, jumped over my shoulder, grabbed the snake, rolled, and disappeared along with the snake between me and the kitten. Before I could understand what had happened, the kitten spoke in human language.
The snake is yours, the cat is not.
What? The snake isn't mine.
No need to look anymore. I searched everywhere that day and found nothing.
It interrupted me, looking very sad.
It was too dark. They couldn't find it, and neither could we.
The cat finished speaking, stretched lazily, and walked away dejectedly. Then I woke up. I told Helen about the dream and what had happened by the riverbank the previous day.
I don't know why, but I feel the dream was connected to the little house I visited.
Helen ate her meal without showing any emotion. After dinner, I helped Helen clean up the dishes. She got up, took 2 prayer mats, and we knelt by the bed, praying for a long time. I never asked what Helen prayed for that day. Perhaps she never asked anything from her faith, only seeking guidance from God for what I was about to do. God probably didn't respond to her, but I knew Helen hoped I would find the answer myself. Without waiting for the next Tuesday, the next morning, I rode my bike along the riverbank, searching. I passed endless rice fields, paths branching off from the church, and crab farmers' ponds, but I never found the little house where I had borrowed water and eaten. I thought I had walked the entire afternoon that day, so maybe I hadn't searched far enough. So I stood up and pedaled faster, scanning both sides for any clues. There was nothing. Narrator, tone, serious during this time. I even thought I saw the small house with red bricks and white tiles from that day. But along the way, there were no houses to be found, not even traces of demolished ones. Narrator, tone, serious. I pedaled mechanically, moving forward until a T-junction appeared faintly ahead. Narrator, tone, serious. As I approached the T-junction, I realized that this was the end of the riverbank. Narrator, tone, excited. At the end of the riverbank was another riverbank, with a river in between. On the other side were many households, indicating a bustling village. Narrator, tone, angry. Driven by an inexplicable anger, I was determined to find out why I couldn't locate the family guarding the crab pond. Narrator, tone, determined. I crossed a bridge along the new riverbank, ready to muster the courage to ask every adult I encountered if they had seen the family of 4 guarding the crab pond on the other riverbank. Narrator, tone, serious. After walking for a while, an elderly lady with a cane approached me. I immediately recognized her as the strange-looking woman from the riverbank that day. Narrator, tone, shy. Taking a deep breath, I tentatively asked, "Hello, ma'am, may I ask you something?" Narrator, tone, serious. The old lady raised her head sharply upon hearing me and stared at me intensely. Narrator, tone, serious. Her eyes were bloodshot, and the swelling under her eyes made it hard to tell if it was from lack of sleep or years of accumulated sorrow. Narrator, tone, shy. I was taken aback but pressed on. I want to ask if you know of a family of 4 guarding the crab pond on the other riverbank? Narrator, tone, friendly. The old lady grabbed my elbow with both hands, her reddened eyes suddenly welling up with tears. Narrator, tone, shy. I panicked and tried to pull out a hand to see if I had any tissues. Narrator, tone, friendly. Seeing this, the old lady tightened her grip and shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Young lady, have you seen them somewhere? Narrator, tone, puzzled. Her question left me puzzled. A couple of days ago, I met a small wooden house on that riverbank and went in to borrow a bowl of water. Narrator, tone, hopeful. I thought for a moment and added, they have a little girl who's half a head shorter than me. I think her name is Emily. Narrator, tone, terrified. Like a bolt of lightning, the old lady collapsed to the ground, crying uncontrollably. Soon, many villagers gathered around, helping Margaret up and bombarding me with questions.
Aren't you Margaret's granddaughter? You look so much like her.
What did you say to Margaret? Why did she start talking about her son's whereabouts?
Margaret is quite peculiar usually. If you're scared, you should hurry home.
I didn't leave, convinced that Margaret knew the family I was looking for. So, I followed the crowd to take her home. It was a small wooden house, similar in layout to the night watchman's house by the riverbank, dim, cramped, but tidy. The difference was that this house had a door on the left side, directly connecting to a larger concrete house next door, a new 2-story building. I peeked into the living room of the big house and saw 4 or 5 certificates on the wall, each titled Emily. It seemed clear that Margaret was Emily's grandmother. The crowd gradually dispersed, looking as if they were used to Margaret needing help to get home. I stood in the middle of the small house, touching the stove on the right, which was still warm. A cat lay listlessly on the fire seat. I walked over to the bed in the inner room and sat beside Margaret, who was lying with her back to me. From her breathing, it seemed she had calmed down.
Whose child are you? Did you come to poke at my heart because you heard my son and daughter-in-law are missing?
She said this as casually as if she were talking about having porridge for breakfast. I wondered if she was referring to the family by the riverbank. How could they be missing?
I'm looking for them too. How could they just disappear in 2 days?
Just these 2 days? You mean you saw Emily just these 2 days?
Seeing her reaction, I recounted the events of the evening before last in detail.
Emily offered me water. Her mother was sewing. Her father set up a stove on the slope to cook dinner. And her brother was skipping stones.
As I was about to mention that Emily had invited me to bury a time capsule with her next time, Margaret, who had been silent for a while, suddenly asked,
What were they wearing?
It felt like a thunderclap above my head. I could clearly feel my hair standing on end from head to toe. After a moment, she trembled and replied,
They were wearing long sleeves and pants, 2 or 3 layers.
The door connecting to the big house creaked open, and a cold wind blew in, accompanied by rustling sounds. I turned around suddenly to see a certificate of merit, slightly curled, being blown into the room.
Good girl, they haven't been missing for 2 days. It's been 2 years.
I chatted with Margaret for a long time and finally understood the whole story.
A few years ago, my son took on the job of guarding the crab fields for the village. To make living more convenient, they built a larger night watch house on the riverbank and moved his wife and 2 children there.
At night, her son would keep watch while the wife and children slept in the wooden house. The children went to and from school, making the wooden house and school their 2 main points of activity. Occasionally, when they had some free time during the day, the son and daughter-in-law would take turns bringing the children back to the village to visit Margaret.
They would cook for me, do laundry, and take me shopping.
2 years ago, in the autumn.
It was the Mid-Autumn Festival. That afternoon, the couple brought the children back to the village, bringing me mooncakes and a hand-knitted sweater.
The family had a reunion dinner and only returned home after dark. Since then, they never came back.
For the first 2 days, I didn't notice anything unusual. But when more familiar faces from the village came to tell me that the wooden house on the riverbank was wide open with no one in sight, I couldn't sit still.
Leaning on her cane, she walked the riverbank countless times at sunset but never found a trace of her family.
They say my son went to work out of town, but that's impossible. He would never leave without telling me.
My heart ached for her, and I didn't know how to comfort Margaret. I thought about my own situation over the past 2 days. Even if I told Margaret, how could she believe me?
I will definitely find them.
Awkwardly, I took my leave, determined to visit Margaret again tomorrow. As I stepped out of the small house, I took a deep breath, replaying in my mind the details of the day I met the family and the dreams I had when I was feverish. Usually, when Helen prayed, I would close my eyes perfunctorily, never imagining I would one day sincerely hope for divine guidance. Passing a few households, I returned to the new riverbank, ready to go back to the bridge to get my bicycle. At the door of another house down the slope, a few couples sitting together waved to me.
"Hey, little girl. Come down here, we want to have a word with you."
I walked over hesitantly, and one of the women grabbed me and sat me down on a small stool.
Did Margaret tell you that her son and daughter-in-law are missing?
One of the men spoke up, cracking sunflower seeds in his mouth.
"Isn't that the case? I was even more puzzled."
He spat out the shells and looked towards the woman beside him.
"Not at all. How could living people just disappear?"
If you ask me, that daughter-in-law was involved with Mark. She didn't run away. Her husband went after her.
The remnants of sunflower seeds at the corner of his mouth made me feel nauseous.
Didn't Mark say last year during the New Year that he had dinner with them?
They chuckled quietly and glanced towards Margaret's house.
How could she have the face to come back? The whole village knows.
But I saw them at the riverbank a few days ago, and even went in for a bowl of water.
"You're making things up. That house was burned down by some village kids 2 years ago. Where did you get water?"
I was startled. A family dressed in autumn clothes in the middle of summer, a non-existent wooden house.
"Who is Mark?"
Not wanting to dwell on the issue, I asked him.
Did anyone else see them having dinner?
The man was clearly stumped by my question and suddenly got angry.
"What do you know? She even texted my wife to borrow money. James said he received messages too, but the old folks just didn't believe it."
When did this happen? Did you lend them money?
"How could we lend money? Doing that means they wouldn't come back to repay it. We couldn't ask her husband for it later, could we?"
They chuckled quietly again. Feeling physically uncomfortable, I quickly got up and walked back to Margaret's house, picked her up, and rode my bike straight to town. I accompanied Margaret to report to the police.
How do we report someone missing? Wouldn't that mean they'd be put in jail if found?
I was surprised that after 2 years, no one had seriously suggested or explained to Margaret the possibility of seeking help. We soon arrived at the police station, and I told the officer everything I had seen and heard.
A family of 4 disappeared while keeping watch by the riverbank, leaving behind a widowed elder. A young man from the same village, named James, is highly suspicious. If the family of 4 is indeed living in another city, James might be the only one who knows their whereabouts.
The officer took notes seriously.
Is that correct?
Yes. The wooden house where the family of 4 used to live was burned down by village kids. The original site should be directly across from the crab pond, with a red brick, white tiled house on the opposite bank.
The officer glanced at me, probably wondering how I knew so much. There could be many reasons, or maybe he just saw me as a child and didn't ask further.
Leave your address and contact information, and ask your relatives and friends if they know anything. Please make sure they cooperate and inform us. We will conduct visits and investigations in the coming days and notify you if we find anything.
The officer closed his notebook and pushed a piece of paper and a pen towards us. Margaret only left her home address and then returned to the village with me. On the way back, I couldn't help but remind Margaret not to ask about that person named Mark and his family, to avoid alerting them.
Little girl, today you told me about meeting their family of 4 at sunset. I've thought it over carefully. They might not be alive anymore. You also mentioned that Mark had dinner with them, which he never told me. And I don't believe my daughter-in-law borrowed money from them. They were very frugal and not the type to live beyond their means. If they needed to borrow money, it must have been a serious situation.
Hearing Margaret say this, I wanted to comfort her, but a bad premonition stopped me, and I swallowed my words. In the following days, I went to the police station every morning to ask for updates. The officers thought I was a relative sent by Margaret and shared the progress with me. James had fabricated stories multiple times over the past 2 years, claiming to have had meals with the missing people and that they borrowed money from him. When the police questioned him, his story was full of holes, and he eventually stopped answering calls. Later, James was arrested and confessed after 2 days of interrogation, but the outcome was unexpected. The last verifiable contact with the missing family was indeed James, but it wasn't as I had thought. He hadn't harmed the family of 4. According to him, on that mid-autumn night, James, who was idling away his days, targeted a well-stocked cabin of a family who were night watchmen.
I thought the place was remote and sparsely populated and knew the family would return to the village for the festival. Believing there was cash hidden in the cabin, I gathered a few thugs and broke in under the cover of darkness, ransacking the place.
Unexpectedly, the family returned, laughing and talking. We fled in panic but ran into the family face-to-face before escaping.
Later, when he learned the family had disappeared, he feared others would find out about that night and suspect him. So he incited a local student to burn down the cabin and repeatedly lied about the couple to confuse the situation. Hearing this, I was deeply disappointed. After all this, was this the unsatisfactory conclusion? If James was merely a thief, where did the family of 4 go? Is he lying? I asked the officer.
We need to find them alive or find their remains. Without any traces, there's no direct evidence. We've searched the cabin site many times but found nothing. Every year, there are missing persons cases that remain unsolved.
Unsolved. I pondered this word, trying to recall any overlooked details. Could they have drowned in the river?
A family of 4, all at once?
Yes, all at once. Or maybe, the spirits, a child fell in, and the parents tried to save them, but couldn't?
Couldn't save them. It's possible, the river is very deep.
In the end, there was no conclusion, only conjecture. I felt a heavy weight in my heart, understanding for the first time what it meant to be powerless. After that day, I never went to the police station again. Summer passed quickly. The days that followed were filled with watching TV, eating ice cream, and playing house with Lily. We had a great time. That evening by the riverbank, with the cozy glow of the little wooden house and the awkward yet refreshing glass of water, felt like a memory from a past life. Sometimes, in a daze, I couldn't even tell if it was a dream I had. With the new school term approaching, I was about to head back home to register for school. The day before I left, I went to meet Emily for the last time. I emptied and cleaned an old cookie tin, filled it with 100 paper cranes, and added a stack of my favorite comic character cards before heading to the little wooden house. Finding the spot near the white-tiled house, I started digging on the corresponding riverbank slope. As I dug, my small shovel hit something hard. It was a small piggy bank, and it jingled when I shook it.
This must have been buried by Emily. No matter what, this piggy bank should be returned to her grandmother.
I knew Margaret was still waiting alone for some resolution, and I was very afraid to face her because I felt a deep sense of guilt for not fulfilling her trust. But this might be one of the few things Emily left behind, and perhaps it contained items of great sentimental value. After much thought, I decided to head to Margaret's house. It was another evening, and Margaret's little wooden house looked just like the home by the riverbank that night. The difference was, this time the house was filled with people, neighbors gathered around, and several officers were present. I squeezed through the crowd with difficulty, only to see an officer showing some photos to Margaret. The things in the photos were swollen and unrecognizable, looking like a pile of clothes.
These were retrieved from the lake downstream of Qingjia village. They hadn't been discovered for 2 years and just floated up recently.
The officer was trying hard to suppress his emotions.
James has confessed. That day, they ran into the victim face to face. The group fled immediately. Later, fearing the victim would recognize them and tarnish their reputation, they returned to the scene and threw the 2 children playing outside into the river, hiding to wait for the adults to come out and rescue them. Who would have thought the man could swim? To ensure their plan succeeded, they held the woman hostage, preventing the man from coming ashore, while others used bamboo poles to block him. The man and the 2 children eventually drowned. They then harmed the woman and threw her into the water. Only the 2 adults have been found so far. The lake has been drained, and the search continues. This case is truly, for such a reason, it's beyond inhumane.
Another officer quickly turned to stop his colleague and added,
"There was no physical evidence back then. James only confessed halfway. But as they say, justice will prevail."
It really was drowning, only half the story.
I didn't dare to look closely at Margaret's expression, only feeling that she was unusually calm, not crying or shouting, just repeatedly looking at those unrecognizable photos. Suddenly, she looked up and saw me in the crowd.
Good girl, you came at the right time.
Margaret's tear-filled eyes were smiling.
They've been found. Didn't I say? They couldn't have gone far without telling me.
My tears fell first, and I bit my lip, not knowing what to say.
This was dug up near the wooden house.
I handed the piggy bank to Margaret. She was momentarily stunned, then reached out to take it, her aged hands gently caressing the piggy bank.
It's Emily's. I bought it for her in town.
Wiping away my tears, I smiled at Margaret.
Compared to the unknown and the tarnished reputation of her loved ones, the hope for the truth to come out was probably her final wish.
It was getting dark again, and I needed to head home early. Squeezing out of the crowd, I crossed the bridge and stood at the T-junction, looking towards the riverbank. In the distance, a night watch hut had been set up near the crab fields, with familiar dim lights glowing inside, as if waiting for me to get thirsty and go in for a drink.